Everything you think you know about alcohol is a lie. Every remedy, every rule, every fact you've repeated with confidence at a party. 51 of them. Starting now. 1. The moment alcohol hits your bloodstream, you feel warm, flushed, and perfectly insulated against whatever weather is happening outside, and generations of people have used this sensation to justify a drink in cold conditions as though it were a medically sound intervention. It is not. Alcohol does not warm your core temperature, it does the exact opposite, and the mechanism behind this is almost insulting in how thoroughly it betrays you. Alcohol causes peripheral vasodilation, meaning the blood vessels near the surface of your skin widen and flood outward with warm blood, which is exactly why you feel that flush. What you are not being told is that the blood now rushing to your skin is blood that was previously warming your vital organs. You have redirected your body's heat supply from the engine room to the exterior walls, and the exterior walls do not need it nearly as much. This dramatically accelerates the rate at which your core body temperature drops, sometimes by several degrees, while your brain registers nothing but a pleasant warmth it is completely wrong about. Military cold weather survival protocols and emergency medicine literature both explicitly warn against alcohol consumption in freezing environments for this precise reason. The danger is compounded because the subjective feeling of warmth causes people to stop seeking shelter, stop layering up, and stop taking the cold seriously because their nervous system is confidently reporting a situation that does not exist. Hypothermia deaths have been directly linked to alcohol consumption in cold environments in documented case literature. You are not warm. Your body has simply redirected its budget, started spending from the wrong account, and handed you a receipt that reads comfortable, while the actual balance hits 0. 2. 2 cups of strong black coffee after a heavy night, and you're convinced you're functional again. Fit to drive, hold a conversation, maybe even make a decision you won't regret. Coffee is the universal antidote to intoxication in the cultural imagination, and the cultural imagination is completely wrong about this. Coffee does not metabolize alcohol. It does not reduce your blood alcohol concentration by a single measurable point. It does not restore the cognitive functions that alcohol has temporarily disabled. What it does, with genuine pharmacological reliability, is make you a more alert drunk, and that specific outcome is arguably more dangerous than simply being a tired one. Your liver processes alcohol at a fixed rate of approximately 0.015%. Blood alcohol concentration per hour, regardless of what you consume alongside it. Caffeine is a stimulant that blocks adenosine receptors, which reduces the sensation of drowsiness, but drowsiness and impaired judgment are not the same physiological state, and treating one does not address the other. Studies have shown that caffeinated drinkers rate themselves as significantly more sober than uncaffeinated drinkers at the same blood alcohol level, while performing equally poorly on reaction time and decision-making assessments. This gap between perceived and actual capacity is the precise mechanism that makes this combination dangerous. The FDA banned caffeinated alcoholic beverages in 2010, partly for this exact documented reason. Researchers coined the phrase wide awake drunk to describe the resulting state, alert, confident, and fully impaired, which sounds like a joke and functions like a public safety crisis. Breath tests and blood tests are not affected by caffeine intake. The number does not change. You have given a blindfolded driver a double espresso. He is more energetic. He is still blindfolded. The coffee did not remove the blindfold. It just made him feel ready to go. 3. Line your stomach before you go out. Everyone knows this. A heavy meal before drinking is a preemptive shield, a responsible choice that neutralizes incoming alcohol before it can do any serious damage to your evening or your morning after. People plan around this. They eat strategically. They feel prepared. And they are operating on a meaningful but deeply misunderstood piece of biology that leads directly to drinking more than they intended. Food does not block alcohol, it delays it. The alcohol still arrives in your bloodstream in full at the same total quantity. What changes is the timeline of arrival, because food in the stomach slows gastric emptying, meaning alcohol reaches the small intestine, where the majority of absorption occurs, more gradually than on an empty stomach. Peak blood alcohol concentration with food present can be 30 to 50% lower than fasted drinking, which sounds protective until you understand that the total amount of alcohol absorbed over time remains identical. The delayed absorption curve is the real problem because it causes you to underestimate how intoxicated you are in real time. You drink, you feel relatively fine, you drink more, and then 2 hours later, the full load arrives. High-fat meals create the longest delay, which is why the advice sounds so plausible. The effect is genuinely real. It is just not doing what people believe it is doing. Research also documents a second wave phenomenon where drinkers who ate before drinking experience a delayed surge of intoxication several hours in, particularly after they've stopped drinking and the stomach continues to empty. The lined stomach is not a wall. It is a traffic delay system. Every car you sent is still on its way. You simply cannot see them coming, and that is the part that gets you. 4. Never mix the grape and the grain. This rhyme has been repeated with the conviction of pharmaceutical law at every social gathering for decades. The sequencing and combination of drink types is treated as a critical medical variable with genuine consequences for how sick you will feel the next morning. Switch from beer to wine to spirits in a single evening, and you have, apparently, committed some kind of biological crime against your own body. You have not. Your liver does not know what vessel the alcohol arrived in. It does not have brand preferences or beverage categories. It processes one thing: ethyl alcohol. A standard drink is defined as 14 grams of pure ethanol, whether it comes from a beer, a wine glass, or a spirit measure, and the metabolic pathway is identical across all of them. Multiple clinical trials have directly tested the mixing hypothesis, including research published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and found no evidence that drink sequencing affects hangover severity or intoxication level when total alcohol consumed is held constant. The reason mixing feels worse is behavioral, not chemical. Switching drinks disrupts your internal accounting of units consumed, making it harder to track how much you have actually had. People who start with beer tend to drink for longer sessions, consume more total alcohol, and then blame the switch to spirits for the outcome. The one genuine variable is carbonation. Fizzy mixers do accelerate alcohol absorption by opening the pyloric valve and speeding delivery to the small intestine, which is worth knowing. The dark spirits and red wine hangover premium is also real, but it comes from congeners, not mixing. The debt doesn't care what currency you paid it in. Your bank account processes all of it the same way. 5. Every drink you take destroys irreplaceable brain cells. This is stated with the confidence of established neuroscience at dinner tables, in school health classes, and in well-meaning intervention conversations across decades of public health messaging. It is the kind of claim that feels intuitively correct, gets repeated constantly, and turns out to be a significant oversimplification of what alcohol actually does to your brain. Alcohol does not kill neurons outright, at least not at the levels associated with moderate to heavy social drinking. The reality is simultaneously more nuanced and, in some ways, more troubling than the cell death narrative. Research from the 1990s onward, including work by neurologist Greta Jensen, found no significant neuronal death in the cerebral cortex at the drinking levels most people associate with harm. What alcohol does damage are the dendrites, the branching connectors between neurons that allow them to communicate. It disrupts the network without eliminating the nodes. Heavy chronic use does produce measurable brain volume reduction, particularly in white matter, but this reflects cellular shrinkage and dendritic damage rather than wholesale cell death. The hippocampus is particularly vulnerable, which is why alcohol impairs the formation of new memories and produces blackouts. Not because neurons are dying, but because communication between them is being chemically jammed. The partial recovery of white matter volume, documented in imaging studies of people who achieve sustained sobriety, is only possible because the underlying cells were not destroyed. You cannot regrow what was killed. You can reconnect what was disrupted. The kills brain cells framing almost certainly originates from 1970s anti-drug messaging that simplified the available neurological evidence beyond what it could support. It is not killing the workers. It is cutting the telephone lines between them. The office exists. Nobody can coordinate. 6, hot sauna, hard workout, intense sweat session. This is how you accelerate the departure of last night's alcohol from your body. Flush the toxins out through your pores. Sweat your way back to functional. People do this with genuine conviction, treating it as a biologically logical shortcut to sobriety, and it is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how alcohol actually leaves your system. Sweating eliminates a negligible fraction of consumed alcohol. Your liver handles over 90% of alcohol metabolism through the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase, converting ethanol first to acetaldehyde and then to acetate, which your body can use as fuel. Sweat, breath, and urine together account for less than 10% of total elimination, and sweat represents only a portion of that fraction. Exercising while alcohol remains in your bloodstream is genuinely dangerous. It elevates heart rate, promotes dehydration, and does not accelerate blood alcohol concentration reduction by any measurable clinical standard. Sauna use while intoxicated has been associated with cardiac events because alcohol and heat stress both independently strain the cardiovascular system, and combining them compounds that load significantly. The rate-limiting step in alcohol metabolism is the liver's fixed enzymatic capacity, and no external intervention has been shown to meaningfully increase that rate. Cold showers, exercise, steam rooms, none of them affect the metabolic clock. The misconception survives because sweating feels productive. The physical sensation of effort gets confused with actual metabolic clearance, and the two have essentially nothing to do with each other. Your liver is the only drain in this system. You are standing outside pouring effort onto the exterior of the bathtub and wondering why the water level isn't dropping. The drain is inside. It runs at its own pace. You cannot negotiate with it. 7, a drink or two, and you are energized, more social, more confident, ready for whatever the evening holds. Alcohol clearly has a stimulant quality to it. It gets you going, loosens you up, removes the weight of the day. This is what you experience. This is what most people experience. And the pharmacological classification of alcohol as a central nervous system depressant seems to directly contradict your lived reality, which is why so many people simply do not believe it. The contradiction is resolved once you understand which brain systems get depressed first and in what order. Alcohol enhances the effect of GABA, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, and suppresses glutamate, the primary excitatory one. At low blood alcohol concentrations, the first regions to be affected are those responsible for impulse control, self-monitoring, and social anxiety. The internal editor, the self-critic, the voice that tells you not to say the thing you want to say. These systems go quiet before anything else does. What you experience as energy and confidence is not stimulation being added, it is inhibition being removed. The brakes go first. This is documented in pharmacology literature as the biphasic effect. An initial disinhibition window that feels activating, followed by progressive sedation as blood alcohol concentration continues to rise and the depressant effects expand to broader neural systems. Speech slows, motor coordination degrades, reaction time extends. The arc is consistent and predictable. Conflating early disinhibition with genuine stimulation is a cognitive error with real-world consequences, particularly for people who make driving or judgment calls in that initial window feeling sharper than they actually are. You did not add horsepower to the system, you cut the brake lines, the car feels faster, it is just becoming progressively harder to stop. 8. Dark spirits are the heavy hitters, whiskey, bourbon, aged rum. And the morning after a night on them is universally understood to be worse than a night on vodka or gin at equivalent volumes. Most people attribute this to the dark liquors being somehow stronger, more concentrated, more chemically intense. The actual explanation has nothing to do with alcohol strength and everything to do with a category of chemical compounds called congeners, which are the byproduct molecules produced during fermentation and concentrated during the aging process, and which your body has a genuinely unpleasant time processing. Congeners include acetone, acetaldehyde, tannins, and fusel alcohols, a collection of organic compounds that arrive alongside the ethanol and create additional metabolic burden your liver has to address after it finishes with the alcohol itself. Bourbon whiskey has been measured to contain approximately 37 times more congeners than vodka, which is filtered specifically to remove them. This is not a marginal difference. Research published in Alcoholism. Clinical and experimental research confirmed that bourbon drinkers reported significantly worse hangover symptoms than vodka drinkers, consuming equivalent amounts of alcohol. Same total ethanol, meaningfully different morning. Acetaldehyde, a primary congener and also the first metabolic intermediate of alcohol breakdown, is itself a toxic compound that contributes directly to nausea, headache, and cardiovascular stress. The wood aging process in barrels introduces additional tannins and compounds that further increase congener load, and this is not a manufacturing flaw. That complexity is precisely what aged spirits taste like. The hangover premium is the flavor premium's invoice. Dark liquors do not hit harder because they are stronger. They hit harder because they bring company. And the company is specifically the kind that trashes your apartment and is still there in the morning. 9. A glass of something before bed is practically medicinal. It relaxes you, quiets the mental noise, speeds up the process of falling asleep. The nightcap tradition has generations of adherents who will tell you it works, and they are not entirely wrong about the falling asleep part. They are completely wrong about what happens to the quality of that sleep, and the distinction between falling asleep and actually sleeping is where the entire benefit evaporates. Alcohol initially suppresses REM sleep, the stage responsible for memory consolidation, emotional processing, and the majority of your brain's overnight restoration work. The first half of the night is faster and deeper in the way a sedated state can be, which is why it feels like it's working. Then the alcohol gets metabolized. As blood alcohol concentration drops, the brain rebounds with increased neural activity to compensate for the artificial suppression. And that rebound fractures the second half of the night with vivid dreams, fragmented sleep, early waking, and a feeling of having been awake more than you actually were. A meta-analysis of 27 studies confirmed that alcohol reduced time to sleep onset while significantly reducing REM sleep duration and overall sleep quality across all dose levels tested. The suppression is dose-dependent, meaning even moderate amounts produce measurable disruption. Regular use of alcohol as a sleep aid leads to tolerance, requiring progressively more alcohol to achieve the same initial sedative effect, which is a recognized behavioral pathway toward dependency. Your body runs 4 to 5 sleep cycles overnight. Alcohol compresses and disrupts the architecture of those cycles in ways that leave you functionally unrested regardless of total hours in bed. You bribed the bouncer to get into the building faster. He locked all the doors to the rooms where the actual work happens once you were inside. 10. You cut yourself, you pour alcohol on it. This is the universal first aid reflex practiced across generations and reinforced by the burning sensation that confirms something productive is happening. The sting feels like proof. It feels like the alcohol is attacking the bacteria, doing the job, cleaning the wound the way a strong cleaner is supposed to clean a surface. The burning is real. The sterilization logic on an open wound is not, and modern wound care has moved firmly away from this practice for reasons that are biologically straightforward once you understand what is actually being damaged. Isopropyl alcohol and ethanol at typical concentrations do kill bacteria on intact skin surfaces. This part is valid. The problem is that on open wounds, alcohol is cytotoxic, meaning it damages and kills the fibroblasts, the cells responsible for producing collagen, closing the wound, and building new tissue. By applying alcohol to an open injury, you are killing the bacterial threat and simultaneously disabling the repair crew that arrived to fix the damage. Research in wound care literature consistently shows that alcohol application to open tissue delays healing and increases scarring risk. The American Academy of Dermatology and current first aid protocols recommend clean water and mild soap for wound irrigation, not alcohol or hydrogen peroxide. The stinging sensation creates a powerful psychological association between pain and efficacy. It feels like it is working because it hurts. But the sensation is the tissue damage occurring, not the healing. Alcohol remains entirely appropriate for sterilizing intact skin before an injection or procedure. The error is applying surface disinfection logic to a context where the surface no longer exists. You killed the burglars and the homeowners, the threat is neutralized. So is everything that was trying to fix the house. 11. Beer before liquor. Never been sicker. Liquor before beer, you're in the clear. This rhyme has been recited with the authority of medical law at social gatherings across multiple decades and multiple continents. The sequencing of beverage types is treated as a genuine pharmacological variable with real consequences for how the night ends and how the morning begins. It is not. The sequence has no pharmacological relevance. Your stomach and liver do not maintain a preference queue based on what arrived first. They process one thing, which is ethyl alcohol, and the only variable that governs your level of intoxication and the severity of your hangover is how much total alcohol you consumed. Multiple clinical trials have directly examined this belief, including research from the University of Witten-Herdecke published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and found zero evidence that drink ordering affects intoxication or next-day symptoms when total alcohol consumed is held constant. Blood alcohol concentration and hangover severity correlated entirely with how drunk participants felt at peak intoxication, not with the sequence of beverages consumed to get there. The rhyme survives because it appears to work anecdotally, and it appears to work because of behavioral patterns rather than chemistry. People who start with beer tend to drink for longer sessions and consume more total alcohol, then blame the switch to spirits. People who start with spirits often drink fewer total drinks, consume less overall, and credit the sequencing. The same study confirmed this behavioral explanation. The rhyme functions as a memorable heuristic that gives people a sense of control over an outcome that is entirely governed by volume, not order. You're debating whether to put your left shoe or your right shoe on first before walking into traffic. The shoe order is not the variable that matters here. 12. If alcohol destroys bacteria on surfaces and forms the active ingredient in hand sanitizer, then drinking it must provide some level of internal antimicrobial protection. This logic gained genuinely alarming traction during global health crises, with people deliberately consuming high-proof spirits as a preventive strategy against respiratory illness. The logic is internally consistent in the way that a lot of dangerous ideas are internally consistent. It is also completely wrong. The alcohol concentrations required to kill pathogens on surfaces run between 60 and 70% ethanol. Standard spirits range from roughly 20 to 50% alcohol by volume, already below the effective threshold before they are consumed. Once swallowed, that concentration is immediately diluted by saliva, gastric contents, and stomach acid, dropping the effective concentration at any point of contact with internal tissue far below anything that functions as a disinfectant. The World Health Organization and public health agencies across multiple countries issued explicit statements during the COVID-19 pandemic specifically addressing this misconception. In Iran in 2020, hundreds of people died and thousands were hospitalized after consuming methanol-contaminated homemade spirits in the belief that high-proof alcohol would provide protection. Beyond the concentration problem, there is an anatomical one. Respiratory viruses do not colonize your stomach. The site of infection and the site of alcohol absorption are entirely different systems, making the logic incoherent at the most basic level of human anatomy. Alcohol at elevated blood alcohol concentrations also measurably suppresses immune function, reducing natural killer cell activity and cytokine production, making you objectively more susceptible to infection rather than less. Spraying cleaning solution on your front door does not sanitize your lungs. Drinking it confirms this in the worst way the experiment could possibly run. 13. You know your limits. You have years of experience. You know what 2 drinks feels like versus 4, and you can tell internally and reliably where you are on the spectrum at any given moment during an evening. This confidence is not just misplaced. It is the direct product of the very impairment you are trying to assess. Alcohol specifically compromises the brain systems responsible for self-evaluation, and it does so proportionally. The more impaired you are, the more confident you feel, and the less accurately you can judge your own state. This is not a character flaw, it is a documented neurological mechanism. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for self-monitoring, risk assessment, and judgment, is among the first brain regions affected by rising blood alcohol concentration. Studies consistently show that subjective feelings of intoxication diverge significantly from objective BAC measurements, with the direction of error almost always toward underestimation as BAC increases. The gap is not small. Research on drinking and driving specifically shows that people at 0.08% blood alcohol, the legal limit in most jurisdictions, frequently self-assess as fine to drive. Tolerance makes this worse. Regular drinkers feel subjectively less intoxicated at identical BAC levels compared to less frequent drinkers, while their objective performance on coordination and cognitive tasks is similarly degraded. This is exactly why BAC testing technology exists at all. The entire legal and enforcement infrastructure around impaired driving operates on the explicit premise that self-reported sobriety is not a reliable measurement. You are using a broken thermometer to evaluate whether you have a fever. It keeps reading normal. You have been running a temperature for 45 minutes. The reading feels authoritative. The instrument is the problem. 14, a drink or two, and you are genuinely better at socializing, funnier, more comfortable, more engaging, more likely to say the interesting thing rather than the safe thing. This is not just a feeling, it is observable. People talk to you more. You talk to more people. Alcohol clearly improves social performance, at least at modest amounts, and this appears to be confirmed by every party you have ever attended. The problem is the difference between what you are experiencing and what is actually visible to every sober person in the room, and that gap grows with every drink. Alcohol myopia, the theory developed by psychologists Steele and Josephs, describes the mechanism precisely. Alcohol narrows attention to the most salient immediate cues while reducing capacity to process the subtle, complex signals that competent social interaction actually requires. You stop noticing that the joke didn't land, you miss the sarcasm, you misread the facial expression, you interrupt more, you process less of what other people are saying while believing you are engaged. Research using external observers, people watching drinkers without drinking themselves, consistently shows that social behavior degrades with blood alcohol concentration, even when the drinker self-reports feeling more connected and more competent. One study had participants give speeches under various BAC conditions. Drinkers rated their own performances higher, and independent judges rated them lower. The social confidence is neurologically real. Reflects suppressed self-consciousness, and suppressed self-consciousness does feel like freedom. But confidence without accuracy is not a social skill. It is noise with better posture. You did not become a better musician. You lost the ability to hear how badly you were playing and interpreted that silence as improvement. 15, legality and safety are different things, and nowhere is this more systematically confused than in how most people think about alcohol relative to other substances. The legal status of alcohol implies, in most people's intuitive framework, that it occupies a moderate position on the spectrum of harm. Permitted, regulated, culturally managed, and therefore not among the most dangerous options available. This is a regulatory fact masquerading as a pharmacological one, and the pharmacological evidence tells a very different story. The Nutt et al. Study published in The Lancet in 2010 applied a multi-criteria harm assessment framework to 20 commonly used substances, scoring each across 16 criteria covering harm to users and harm to others. Alcohol ranked as the most harmful drug overall, scoring above heroin, crack cocaine, and methamphetamine when individual and societal damage were combined. The scoring specifically weighted harm to others, crime, family disruption, economic cost, third-party deaths. And alcohol dominated that category decisively because its legal status and social ubiquity create exposure at a scale that illegal substances cannot match. Physical withdrawal from alcohol is among the most medically severe of any substance. Delirium tremens, the most serious form of alcohol withdrawal, carries a mortality rate of up to 15% without medical management, a level of withdrawal danger not typically associated with opioids. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies alcohol as a Group 1 carcinogen, the same category as tobacco and asbestos, based on unambiguous evidence of human cancer causation. The legal status of alcohol reflects centuries of cultural embeddedness, economic interest, and political history. Speed limits are a legal framework. They do not change what happens when you hit something. Legal means permitted. It has never once meant safe. 16. Blast yourself with cold water after a heavy night and the system resets. A cold shower shocks you back to baseline. It wakes you up, clears the fog, gives your body something bracing to respond to. People do this deliberately as a sobriety intervention, and it does produce a genuine and noticeable change in how you feel. That change is the problem. A cold shower makes you a more alert drunk. Your blood alcohol concentration is completely unchanged. Your cognitive impairment is completely unchanged. You are now wet, cold, and equally intoxicated, but you feel more awake. And feeling more awake after a cold shower is specifically more dangerous than feeling drowsy, because drowsy people tend to sit down. The cold exposure triggers an adrenaline response that increases heart rate and subjective alertness without affecting the metabolic clock your liver is running on. BAG drops at approximately 0.015% per hour regardless of temperature, exercise, water exposure, or anything else you do to the outside of your body. The same false mechanism underpins the coffee myth from earlier. Any intervention that increases wakefulness gets misidentified as an intervention that reduces impairment, and the two are entirely different physiological states. Breath tests and blood tests taken immediately after a cold shower would return identical results to tests taken immediately before. The number does not budge. The dangerous downstream outcome is behavioral. People who feel alert after a cold shower are statistically more likely to conclude they are capable of driving, decision-making, or engaging in activities they remain unfit for. Emergency medicine literature on alcohol intoxication management explicitly lists cold water exposure under ineffective interventions. You put ice on the outside of a running oven. The internal temperature is unchanged. You are now just standing in a cold kitchen, feeling confident about the oven. 17. More alcohol in the morning fixes the damage from the night before. A drink at breakfast, a Bloody Mary at brunch. Millions of people treat this not as an indulgence, but as a legitimate therapeutic protocol, and they are not entirely wrong that it produces symptomatic relief. They are completely wrong about what that relief represents and the debt it creates. Hair of the dog delays hangover symptoms by reintroducing the substance causing them, and the delay mechanism is pharmacologically real. Hangover symptoms arise from overlapping processes. Acetaldehyde toxicity as your liver works through the previous night's load, inflammatory cytokine release, dehydration, electrolyte disruption, hypoglycemia, and the sleep architecture damage described earlier. Morning alcohol partially suppresses the acetaldehyde processing that contributes to some of those symptoms temporarily until the new alcohol is also metabolized, at which point the original process resumes with added material to process. The symptomatic relief is genuine and transient. The term itself comes from a medieval medical belief that the bite of a rabid dog could be treated by placing hair from the same dog in the wound. The original logic was wrong at that time too, and it has not improved with age. More importantly, regular use of morning alcohol to manage hangover symptoms is a clinically recognized behavioral pattern specifically associated with the development of alcohol use disorder. Not because it is a character weakness, but because the neurochemical cycle it reinforces is precisely the one that drives escalating dependency. Some researchers note that hair of the dog may function as withdrawal symptom management in already physically dependent drinkers, which means the cases where it seems most necessary are exactly the cases where it is most alarming. You borrowed money to pay a debt. The immediate problem appears solved. You now owe 2 creditors, and one of them charges compound interest. 18. Women can drink as much as men of the same weight because weight is the variable and everything else is irrelevant. This is the equitable math version of alcohol science, and it is wrong in multiple simultaneous directions that have nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with biology. Women reach higher blood alcohol concentrations than men of identical body weight, consuming identical amounts of alcohol, and the reasons stack on top of each other in a way that makes the weight-matching logic insufficient from the start. Women have, on average, lower total body water percentage than men of the same weight, approximately 52% versus 61%, which means the same quantity of alcohol is distributed through a smaller fluid volume, producing a higher resulting concentration. Women also produce less alcohol dehydrogenase in the stomach lining, the primary enzyme responsible for beginning alcohol metabolism before it even reaches the bloodstream, meaning a larger proportion of consumed alcohol reaches systemic circulation unprocessed. Hormonal fluctuations across the menstrual cycle create additional variability, with research showing that women metabolize alcohol more slowly during certain cycle phases, elevating peak blood alcohol concentration further. Higher average body fat percentage relative to muscle mass reduces the aqueous distribution volume available to dilute alcohol, compounding the concentration effect. The clinical consequences of these differences are not minor. Women develop alcohol-related liver disease faster and at lower total consumption levels than men. A compressed disease ARC researchers call telescoping, where the full progression from early liver damage to cirrhosis occurs over a shorter timeline and lower cumulative intake. Standard drink guidelines in multiple countries set lower recommended thresholds for women specifically because of these documented physiological differences, not as a social convention. Same fuel load, smaller tank. The vehicle may weigh the same. You are reading the wrong specification sheet the entire time. 19. Alcohol is empty calories. This is how it gets dismissed nutritionally, as though the harm is limited to the caloric content and everything else about the interaction between alcohol and your body's nutritional systems is neutral. Empty implies passive. It implies that alcohol shows up, contributes some numbers to your daily intake, and otherwise leaves the rest of your nutrition alone. It does not. Calling alcohol empty calories dramatically understates what actually happens, because alcohol does not merely fail to contribute nutrients, it actively interferes with the absorption and metabolism of the nutrients you consumed alongside it, making its net nutritional impact negative rather than neutral. Alcohol inhibits the absorption of thiamine, folate, B12, zinc, and magnesium, a collection of nutrients critical for neurological function, immune health, DNA synthesis, and cell repair. Thiamine deficiency caused specifically by chronic alcohol consumption leads to Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, a severe and often irreversible neurological condition producing memory loss, vision disturbances, and loss of muscle coordination. When alcohol is present in the system, the liver prioritizes its metabolism above all competing processes. Fat oxidation slows, carbohydrate processing is disrupted, and dietary fat consumed alongside alcohol is preferentially stored rather than burned. Alcohol calories register at 7 kilocalories per gram, processed first before any other macronutrient, effectively displacing other fuel sources and interrupting the normal metabolic queue. Chronic alcohol consumption also degrades gut lining integrity, reducing broad nutrient absorption capacity and contributing to malnutrition even in people eating adequate diets. A more accurate description than empty calories would be subtractive calories. Each drink not only adds to the count, but removes resources from the rest of the system. It is not a blank page. It is an eraser that also charges you for the paper it destroys. 20. Premium spirits are purer, more carefully produced, and the elevated price reflects a reduction in the compounds that cause hangovers. Pay more, suffer less. This is the luxury goods logic applied to alcohol, and it survives because it is occasionally partially true in a way that conceals how unreliable it is as a general rule. Price is not a dependable indicator of congener load, chemical purity, or hangover severity. Some of the most expensive spirits available have higher congener content than cheap ones, and that is not a manufacturing oversight. It is the entire point. Aged bourbons and single malt scotches are deliberately complex in their chemistry. The barrel aging process that commands premium prices is specifically the process that introduces tannins, fusyl alcohols, and additional congener compounds that give the spirit its flavor profile. The premium experience and the hangover premium are the same product. High-end vodkas are marketed on filtration and purity, and some genuinely do achieve lower congener counts, but price within the vodka category is not a reliable proxy for filtration quality across brands. Double-blind taste tests, including the famous series of studies by Frederic Brochet examining wine perception, consistently demonstrate that people cannot reliably distinguish expensive from inexpensive alcohol when the label is removed. The label is doing significant sensory work. A study from the California Institute of Technology used functional brain imaging to confirm that participants experienced measurably more neurological pleasure from wine they believed was more expensive. The price information was changing the actual reward response, not merely the verbal report. The most evidence-based path to a less severe hangover remains drinking less total alcohol and choosing lower congener spirits, neither of which requires a premium price point. You bought the designer version of something whose job is to be metabolized into a headache. The packaging did not survive that process. 21. Alcohol takes the edge off anxiety, and this is one of its genuinely useful properties. A well-established pharmacological fact that makes it understandable why so many people reach for a drink when the social situation feels too large or the day has left too much residue. The short-term anxiolytic effect is real. The problem is what happens after, and what happens to your baseline anxiety level when you use this mechanism regularly, because the neurochemical system does not absorb repeated manipulation without adapting, and the adaptation runs in exactly the wrong direction for the goal you started with. Alcohol enhances GABA activity and suppresses glutamate, producing genuine, measurable anxiety reduction in the short term. The brain then compensates for this artificial shift through neuroadaptation. GABA receptors are downregulated, glutamate activity is upregulated, and the net result is that your baseline neural excitability between drinking episodes increases above where it was before you started using alcohol for anxiety management. The anxiety you were drinking to reduce is now higher than it was before the drinking began. This mechanism is also what makes alcohol withdrawal medically dangerous in physically dependent drinkers. Removing the alcohol while the upregulated glutamate system remains active produces seizures, severe panic, and potentially fatal cardiovascular events. Research on social anxiety disorder specifically documents that people who use alcohol to manage social anxiety are at significantly elevated risk for developing alcohol use disorder. Not because they have weak character, but because the pharmacological loop they are using is self-reinforcing in a predictable way. The temporary relief is real. The contractor who provides it installs speakers in the walls as part of the arrangement. The silence while he is working is genuine. The bill arrives later, and the apartment is louder after he leaves than it was before he arrived. 22. The weight impact of alcohol is a calorie math problem. Track your drinks, account for the numbers, maintain a deficit, and the rest sorts itself out. The calories are real, the arithmetic is straightforward, and if you are disciplined about the accounting, the alcohol should not affect your body composition in any way that isn't captured by the total count. This is wrong in several simultaneous ways, because alcohol does not interact with your body as a passive caloric input. It disrupts the hormonal signals that govern hunger and satiety, promotes fat storage through metabolic priority shifts in the liver, and degrade sleep in ways that independently drive appetite dysregulation the following day. When alcohol is present, the liver processes it before everything else, fat burning effectively pauses, and dietary fat consumed alongside drinks is preferentially directed towards storage rather than oxidation. Alcohol suppresses leptin, the hormone that signals satiety, while stimulating ghrelin, the hormone that drives hunger, which is why eating more food while drinking and after drinking is not a discipline failure, it is a hormonal outcome. Research shows that drinkers consistently undercount the calories in their drinks while simultaneously eating more food than they would without alcohol, a double accounting error that makes the deficit calculation unreliable at the point of most relevance. The sleep disruption from alcohol elevates ghrelin and suppresses leptin into the following day, increasing appetite even after no further alcohol is consumed. Cortisol levels rise with alcohol consumption, and elevated cortisol specifically promotes visceral fat accumulation, the abdominal variety, rather than subcutaneous fat. Studies show measurable body composition changes from regular moderate drinking, independent of total caloric balance. You are not just adding an expense to the budget, you are breaking the accounting software and bribing the part of your brain that tells you when you are full. 23, you know roughly where you are on the intoxication scale because you are an adult, with years of drinking experience and a reasonably good sense of your own body. You have calibrated this over time. You know what fine feels like versus impaired. This confidence is not just inaccurate, it is the specific product of the impairment you are trying to assess, and the relationship between confidence and actual blood alcohol concentration is almost perfectly inverted once you get past the early stages. Studies using controlled BAC testing consistently show that individuals underestimate their blood alcohol concentration when above 0.08%, and the magnitude of the error increases as the actual BAC rises. The variables affecting real blood alcohol concentration are numerous and non-obvious: gastric emptying rate, food content, hydration level, fatigue, body fat distribution, and in women, the phase of the menstrual cycle all produce meaningful variation from the same number of drinks. Standard drink sizes are routinely underestimated. A home pour of wine typically runs 50 to 80% larger than a measured standard drink, and cocktail alcohol content is rarely known by the person consuming it. Tolerance compounds the error in a particularly misleading direction. Experienced drinkers feel subjectively less impaired at identical blood alcohol levels compared to infrequent drinkers, while their performance on cognitive and coordination tasks is similarly degraded. Their sense of sobriety has been calibrated against a tolerance-adjusted subjective experience, not against their actual functional capacity. A study on social drinkers found that fewer than 20% of participants correctly identified whether they were above or below the legal driving limit. Breathalyzers and blood tests exist precisely because no self-assessment mechanism is legally or scientifically defensible as a measurement. You are estimating the speed of light using your feelings and a wristwatch. The data feels personal and vivid. It is not useful. 24. A glass of wine during pregnancy is fine if you keep it moderate. Our grandmothers drank and the children were healthy, and the catastrophizing around this issue has gone well beyond what the evidence actually supports. This is one of the most consequential myths on this list, and it is one of the most structurally resistant to correction because it is wrapped in both personal anecdote and a genuine desire to believe that a thing many people did was not harmful. No safe level of alcohol consumption during pregnancy has been established. The CDC, the WHO, and every major obstetric and pediatric medical body globally recommend zero alcohol during pregnancy. Not because modest amounts are definitively proven harmful at the individual level, but because the threshold below which harm does not occur has never been identified, and that threshold is the relevant question. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorders are the leading preventable cause of intellectual disability in developed countries, affecting an estimated 1 in 20 children in some studied populations. Alcohol crosses the placental barrier readily. The fetus is exposed to the same blood alcohol concentration as the mother, while lacking the liver development to metabolize it at any comparable rate. The developing brain is most vulnerable during the first trimester, precisely when many women do not yet know they are pregnant, making the pre-knowledge drinking window medically significant. The majority of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder presentations are not the visible severe cases. They are subtle cognitive, behavioral, and attention-related deficits that are never attributed to prenatal alcohol exposure because the diagnosis was never made. The grandmother observation reflects survivorship bias and the absence of diagnosis infrastructure. FASDs were not defined until the 1970s. The affected people existed before then, they were just labeled differently. Seatbelts were not worn and people survived. That is the description of how luck works. It is not a safety protocol. 25 strong spirits kill the bacteria in questionable food and water. This is the traveling drinker's logic, the field medicine justification, the reason people in uncertain food environments reach for a shot alongside the meal. If alcohol sterilizes surfaces and kills pathogens on contact, the reasoning goes, then consuming it should provide some level of internal and antimicrobial protection to the digestive system it passes through. The concentration problem makes this reasoning fall apart at the first step. Effective bacterial kill on surfaces requires 60 to 70% ethanol concentration. Standard spirits run from roughly 20 to 50% alcohol by volume before consumption. Once swallowed, that concentration is immediately diluted by saliva, gastric contents, and stomach acid, reducing the effective concentration at any point of internal contact to a fraction of the already insufficient starting point. Your stomach's natural hydrochloric acid is already a far more effective antimicrobial environment than any alcohol concentration achievable through drinking. The acid environment that processes your meals is doing genuine pathogen work independently of anything you consume. Studies examining alcohol consumption alongside contaminated food or water show no protective effect against foodborne illness pathogens at drinking concentrations. Alcohol at drinking levels can also impair gut immune defenses by damaging the intestinal lining and reducing secretory immunoglobulin A, an antibody class that plays a specific role in intestinal pathogen defense, meaning drinking alongside a questionable meal may compromise your existing defenses while providing none of the sterilization benefit you imagined. The historical grain of truth in this myth comes from fermented beverages being safer than contaminated water in pre-sanitation environments. But that was about the water being displaced, not about the alcohol cleaning your insides. You poured mild cleaning solution into a running river and declared the water safe. The river absorbed your contribution immediately and continued doing exactly what rivers do. 26. The cardiovascular benefits of red wine are some of the most repeated health claims in popular nutrition, backed by the French paradox, the Mediterranean diet literature, and decades of studies suggesting that moderate drinkers have better heart outcomes than non-drinkers. A glass a day keeps the cardiologist away. Resveratrol is the mechanism. The science is settled, except the resveratrol theory has largely collapsed under clinical scrutiny. The French paradox had multiple confounding explanations unrelated to wine, and the observational studies supporting moderate drinking's cardiac benefits contain a methodological flaw significant enough to substantially reverse the conclusion. Resveratrol, the polyphenol in red wine credited with cardiac protection, failed to demonstrate clinically significant effects on cardiovascular outcomes in human trials at any dosage achievable through normal wine consumption. A pivotal 2014 study published in JAMA Internal Medicine found no correlation between urinary resveratrol levels and cardiovascular disease, cancer, or longevity in a community-based cohort. The French paradox, low heart disease rates despite high saturated fat intake, has been re-examined and attributed to factors including systematic underreporting of heart disease deaths in French mortality data, differences in dairy fat composition, and broader Mediterranean dietary patterns. The observational studies showing better heart outcomes in moderate drinkers suffer from the sick quitter bias. Former drinkers who quit due to existing illness are counted among non-drinkers, making abstinence appear artificially dangerous by comparison. Mendelian randomization studies, using genetic variants in alcohol metabolism to isolate alcohol's actual effect, consistently find no cardiovascular protection. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies alcohol as a Group 1 carcinogen, meaning any claimed cardiac benefit must be weighed against documented multi-site cancer risk beginning at low consumption levels. The study that made wine sound like medicine turned out to be a study about people who were already healthy. The wine was along for the ride. 27, alcohol lowers inhibitions, reduces performance anxiety, and makes the whole experience better for everyone involved. This is practically a cultural consensus acknowledged across virtually every adult social context, and the first part of it is pharmacologically accurate enough to be genuinely misleading about what follows. Alcohol does increase desire. It simultaneously and reliably reduces biological capacity. It is the only commonly used substance that makes you want something more while making your body progressively worse at delivering it, and the gap between the two widens with every additional drink. In men, alcohol is a vasodepressant. It reduces blood flow to peripheral tissue, directly impairing the physiological mechanism underlying erection. This is not anecdotal. Masters and Johnson confirmed in their landmark human sexual response research that increasing blood alcohol concentration produces dose-dependent decreases in erectile function. The common term for this outcome exists because the outcome is common. In women, alcohol reduces genital blood flow and measurable physiological arousal responses while simultaneously increasing subjective feelings of desire, creating a documented gap between how women feel and how their bodies are actually responding, which widens as blood alcohol concentration rises. Delayed or absent orgasm is documented in both sexes at moderate to high blood alcohol levels. Alcohol also reduces tactile sensitivity. The peripheral nervous system's ability to process sensory information is blunted, reducing the intensity of the experience that was supposedly enhanced. The confidence and reduced anxiety that alcohol produces are neurologically real. They reflect suppressed self-consciousness. But confidence without physical capacity is not an enhancement. It is an aspiration operating on a declining platform. You hired a very enthusiastic contractor who has been drinking since noon. He has excellent ideas. He is going to fall asleep in the driveway before the project gets started. 28. If your blood alcohol concentration is below the legal limit, you are safe to drive. The law defines the threshold reflects the science, and anything below the number means you are in the clear. This is one of the most dangerous myths on this list specifically because it involves a real number from a legitimate authority that appears to be doing the work of a safety guarantee when it is actually doing the work of an enforcement threshold, and those are not the same thing. Measurable driving impairment begins at blood alcohol concentrations between 0.02 and 0.04%, well below the 0.08 legal limit in the United States and many other countries. Studies document degradation in reaction time, lane tracking, hazard perception, and visual processing beginning in this range. A 2018 National Highway Traffic Safety Administration report confirmed that drivers at 0.05% blood alcohol, 2 to 3 standard drinks for an average adult, have approximately a 38% increased crash risk, and at 0.08%, risk is approximately doubled relative to zero. The 0.08 standard in the United States was established through a political and legislative process, not derived purely from scientific analysis of the impairment curve. Safety researchers and public health bodies have long advocated for 0.05% limits, which are used across most of Europe and Australia, and countries using the lower limit show meaningfully lower alcohol-related traffic fatality rates. The legal limit represents the point at which enforcement is practical and prosecution is defensible, not the point at which your capacity to operate a vehicle begins to deteriorate. The speed limit does not define when physics becomes dangerous. It defines where the enforcement line sits. Those have always been two different lines. 29, Beer causes the specific abdominal fat pattern known as the beer belly. It is right there in the name. The causal relationship is implicit in the terminology, and generations of people have attributed their midsection accumulation specifically to beer as a beverage rather than to anything more systemic. Beer has something in it, the theory goes. The hops, the carbs, the carbonation, the volume. That targets abdominal fat specifically in a way that other alcohol types do not. The mechanism producing visceral fat accumulation has nothing to do with beer specifically. It operates through caloric surplus, cortisol elevation, and alcohol-induced suppression of fat oxidation, all of which are produced by alcohol broadly, making the association with beer a volume and consumption pattern observation rather than a beer-specific metabolic event. Wine and spirit drinkers who consume equivalent alcohol and equivalent caloric amounts show similar abdominal fat outcomes in controlled comparisons. Beer's caloric density, approximately 150 kilocalories per standard 12-ounce serving, is not dramatically different from a 5-ounce glass of wine at approximately 120 to 130 kilocalories on a per-drink basis. The beer belly association exists primarily because beer is frequently consumed in larger total quantities in social settings, more drinks over longer sessions producing more total alcohol and more total calories. Phytoestrogens in hops have been studied as a potential body composition contributor in heavy beer drinkers, but the effect size in human studies is small and inconsistent across the literature. Visceral fat accumulation is driven by elevated cortisol, impaired sleep, reduced testosterone, systemic alcohol effects, independent of the beverage delivering the alcohol. You name the flood after the tap because that is where you watch the water come out. The problem is the total volume. The tap model was never the relevant variable. 30. Alcohol thins the blood in a way that is cardiovascularly beneficial. This is how the heart health claim gets framed when it moves beyond the red wine mythology and into a more general statement about alcohol and circulation. Thinner blood means better flow, reduced clotting risk, lower chance of the arterial blockages that cause heart attacks. This sounds like a coherent biological mechanism, and it is not entirely fabricated, which is precisely what makes it dangerous as a health justification. Acute alcohol consumption does reduce platelet aggregation temporarily, a measurable anticoagulant effect that is real, short-lived, and not clinically equivalent to any prescribed anticoagulant medication. The full picture of alcohol's effect on the clotting system is dose-dependent and directionally inconsistent. Chronic heavy drinking increases platelet count and activates certain clotting factors in some cases, creating a procoagulant state that elevates risk of stroke and pulmonary embolism. Alcohol significantly increases the risk of hemorrhagic stroke, the bleeding type, even as it may marginally reduce ischemic stroke risk, and the net cardiovascular arithmetic is not clearly favorable. People on prescribed anticoagulants, including warfarin, are specifically warned that alcohol interaction can destabilize their therapeutic range dramatically, producing either dangerous overthinning or effective neutralization of the medication. The observational studies suggesting cardiovascular benefit from moderate alcohol consumption are subject to the same methodological problems noted in the red wine discussion: sick quitter bias, confounding lifestyle variables, and Mendelian randomization analyses that find no protective effect when confounders are properly controlled. No cardiologist prescribes alcohol as an anticoagulant because the benefit to risk ratio compared to actual pharmaceutical options is not medically defensible. It loosens the pipes is not a plumbing strategy, especially when it also corrodes the fittings and occasionally causes the entire system to flood unpredictably. 31. People who become dependent on alcohol simply lack the discipline to stop. Strong people control their drinking, and people who cannot are making a choice to continue, and the solution is willpower applied more seriously to the problem. This framing is not just scientifically inaccurate, it is clinically counterproductive in a specific and measurable way. It reduces the likelihood that people experiencing alcohol use disorder will seek treatment because the moral failure frameworks makes treatment feel like an admission of weakness rather than a response to a disease. The American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and the World Health Organization have classified alcohol use disorder as a chronic, relapsing brain disease based on neurobiological evidence accumulated over decades. Chronic alcohol exposure downregulates dopamine receptors in the brain's reward circuitry, making alcohol progressively the primary effective stimulus for a system that is supposed to motivate a wide range of goals and behaviors. Twin studies place the heritability of alcohol use disorder at 50 to 60%, a genetic contribution that predates and substantially shapes any individual's choices. Structural brain imaging shows measurable reductions in prefrontal cortex volume and activity in people with alcohol use disorder. The region responsible for impulse control is itself impaired by the condition it is supposed to regulate. The physical withdrawal syndrome, potentially fatal without medical management, reflects a biological dependency state whose danger is physiological, not motivational. Effective FDA-approved medications for alcohol use disorder exist: naltrexone, acamprosate, disulfiram, and they work on specific neurochemical pathways. Medications that target willpower do not exist because willpower is not the mechanism. You're telling someone with structurally compromised legs to run harder. The intent may be present. The mechanism it is supposed to operate through has been altered. 32. Expensive wine tastes better, and experienced drinkers can tell the difference. This is the foundational belief of the wine industry's premium pricing structure, and it is not entirely wrong, but it is wrong in the most interesting way possible, which is that the price itself becomes part of the sensory experience in a measurable neurological way that has nothing to do with what is in the glass. Blind taste tests consistently demonstrate that even trained wine professionals cannot reliably distinguish expensive from inexpensive wine when the label is removed and the pour is unidentified. The Friedrich Brochet studies showed that wine experts described the same wine dramatically differently depending on whether it was presented in premium or inexpensive packaging, with no awareness that their descriptions had changed between presentations. A California Institute of Technology study used functional brain imaging to confirm that participants' neurological pleasure responses were measurably higher when they believed the wine was more expensive, even when drinking identical wine across conditions. The price was changing the actual reward signal, not merely the verbal rating. Large-scale wine competition analyses found that the same bottle submitted to multiple competitions received highly variable scores, including both gold medals and no award results, a level of inter-rater inconsistency that undermines the claim of objective quality assessment. Alcohol's own effect on taste discrimination is relevant here. The ability to detect subtle flavor differences decreases as blood alcohol concentration rises through a tasting session, meaning later pours are evaluated with progressively reduced sensory accuracy. The entire premium wine rating apparatus, point scores, vintage charts, varietal hierarchies, has been subjected to statistical analysis that finds low predictive validity for consumer satisfaction when label information is absent. You are paying for a story someone attached to the glass. The liquid inside does not know what it costs and cannot adjust its flavor accordingly. 33. Stay hydrated while drinking. Alternate with water. Keep a glass going throughout the night. And you will wake up feeling close to normal. Dehydration is the cause of hangovers. Water is the antidote, and disciplined hydration during drinking is the responsible drinker's strategy for managing the morning after. The strategy addresses one component of a multi-system problem and leaves the others entirely untouched, which is why people who drink water all night still wake up feeling wrecked and then question their water consumption rather than their model of what a hangover actually is. Alcohol suppresses antidiuretic hormone, increasing urination and fluid loss. This is real. Dehydration is a genuine component of hangover physiology, and hydration does address it. However, studies in which participants were deliberately kept fully hydrated throughout drinking still produce complete hangover symptom profiles the following morning. The inflammatory cytokine release that produces headache, fatigue, nausea, and body ache, specifically interleukin-6, interleukin-10, and interferons, is entirely independent of hydration status. Acetaldehyde, the first metabolic product of alcohol breakdown, is toxic and produces significant symptom burden regardless of how much water you drank alongside it. The disrupted sleep architecture described earlier generates its own next-day effects independent of hydration. What alternating water does accomplish is slowing your consumption pace, which reduces total alcohol intake, which reduces hangover severity through the simplest possible mechanism: you drank less. It is the pacing effect doing the work, not the hydration itself, and the distinction matters because it means the water is a useful tool for consumption management, not a biochemical antidote. You cleaned up part of the mess in advance. The mess still arrived. You have a marginally cleaner baseline from which to deal with it in the morning. 34, a little alcohol is fine. Everything in moderation, a glass here and there, the occasional drink as part of a balanced and otherwise healthy life. The Crate J-curve of health outcomes showed moderate drinkers doing better than the heavy drinkers and even better than non-drinkers across several metrics, and this has been cited so widely and for so long that it has hardened into a near universal belief that low-level alcohol consumption is a medically neutral or slightly beneficial choice. The most comprehensive analysis of global alcohol health data produced to date reached a different conclusion. A 2018 Global Burden of Disease study published in The Lancet analyzed data from 195 countries across 23 health outcomes and concluded that the safest level of alcohol consumption is none, that the risk curve for the combined health burden begins at zero intake, not at some threshold above zero. While moderate alcohol use showed a marginally reduced risk of ischemic heart disease, it was associated with increased risk across a range of cancers, accidents, injuries, and other conditions, yielding a net negative health effect at all consumption levels when outcomes were aggregated. Alcohol is a Group 1 carcinogen whose cancer-causing mechanism, ceamintree, acetaldehyde DNA damage, and folate metabolism disruption, operates at low doses with no established harm-free threshold. The previous apparent cardiovascular benefit in moderate drinkers has been re-examined using Mendelian randomization methods that control for the confounding variables embedded in observational studies, and these analyses consistently find no protective cardiovascular effect once the sick-quitter bias is removed. The no safe level conclusion does not mean one drink produces a medical emergency. It means that at the population level, the health risk floor is not zero consumption plus a small buffer. The floor is zero. A little bit of something harmful is still a little bit of something harmful. That sentence has never meant what people wanted it to mean. 35. Passing out from drinking means your body has made the responsible decision to shut down and sleep it off, and the correct response from everyone around you is to put you somewhere comfortable and let the rest of the night do its work. This belief kills people on a reliable basis, and it kills them precisely because it sounds medically reasonable while being based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what unconsciousness from alcohol actually represents. When someone passes out, their blood alcohol concentration may still be rising. Alcohol present in the stomach and small intestine continues absorbing into the bloodstream after consciousness is lost, meaning the peak has not necessarily been reached at the moment the person goes down. Alcohol suppresses the gag reflex, which means an unconscious person who vomits cannot protect their airway. Aspiration of vomit is a primary cause of alcohol-related death in people who were simply left to sleep it off by people who believed they were being helpful. Alcohol poisoning produces progressive suppression of the brain's control of breathing and heart rate. The person is not sleeping, they are pharmacologically sedated, while their respiratory drive is being chemically undermined. The symptoms requiring emergency response include fewer than 8 breaths per minute, blue-tinged lips or fingertips, unresponsive pupils, and skin that is cold and pale, all of which can be mistaken for normal, heavy drunken sleep and dim lighting by people who are themselves intoxicated. The recovery position, placing the person on their side rather than their back, reduces but does not eliminate aspiration risk and does nothing about the continuing absorption problem. In documented alcohol poisoning deaths involving young people, bystanders who chose not to call emergency services because the person appeared to be sleeping have faced criminal negligence proceedings in multiple jurisdictions. Sleeping is appropriate for someone who is tired. It is not appropriate for someone who has been poisoned and can no longer protect their own airway. 36 young people are more physically resilient and bounce back faster from alcohol. Their metabolism is quicker, their bodies more robust, and the biological consequences that concern older drinkers are less relevant to people in their teens and early 20s. Youth is framed as a buffer, a physiological margin of safety that adult drinkers have lost. The neurological reality runs in the opposite direction. The adolescent and young adult brain is more vulnerable to alcohol's structural effects than the adult brain, not less, and the difference is not marginal. The prefrontal cortex, governing judgment, impulse control, planning, and risk evaluation, is not fully developed until approximately age 25. Alcohol exposure during this critical developmental window impairs a system that is still being built, with consequences that extend well beyond the drinking episode. Animal studies and human neuroimaging research both show that alcohol exposure during adolescence produces greater hippocampal damage and more pronounced memory impairment than equivalent exposure during adulthood. People who begin drinking before age 15 are 4 times more likely to develop alcohol use disorder at some point in their lives compared to those who begin at age 21 or later. A risk differential that reflects the neurological impact of early exposure on developing brain architecture. The adolescent brain is in an active period of synaptic pruning and myelination, the processes that refine and insulate neural pathways, and alcohol disrupts both in ways that can produce lasting architectural changes. Young people do show different subjective sensitivity than adults. They experience less sedation and less motor coordination impairment at equivalent blood alcohol levels. But research indicates this leads to higher total consumption rather than safer drinking. The building is still under construction, the concrete has not set. Applying chemical stress to a structure mid-build does not affect it less because it is newer, it affects it more and the damage becomes load-bearing. 37, not drinking makes you socially difficult, a killjoy, implicitly judgmental about everyone else's choices, someone who creates friction in spaces built around a shared ritual. The pressure to participate is presented as a genuine social requirement, and declining is framed as opting out of the social contract itself. This is a psychological phenomenon with a documented mechanism, not an accurate description of how social environments function. The perceived norm that everyone drinks consistently and significantly overestimates actual group drinking behavior. Research shows that people drink partly to match a social expectation that exists at a higher level in their imagination than it does in the actual room. Studies on alcohol-free social participation find no significant difference in reported enjoyment between drinkers and non-drinkers in mixed settings, though conformity pressure is reported as uncomfortable by some non-drinkers in the moment. The social bonding that occurs in drinking contexts is driven substantially by the shared environment and activity rather than by alcohol itself. Controlled research shows that social connection in enjoyable group settings happens independently of alcohol consumption. The hospitality and entertainment industries have strong and direct economic incentives to reinforce the cultural belief that alcohol is essential to social participation. Alcohol is the highest margin product in virtually every venue that sells it, and the mythology of its social necessity is worth billions annually in maintained demand. Non-alcoholic spirits represent one of the fastest growing beverage categories in multiple markets, reflecting a measurable cultural shift in how people are choosing to participate in social environments. Research on social anxiety specifically shows that people who rely on alcohol to manage social situations report lower long-term social confidence than those who develop social capacity without chemical assistance. The crutch prevents the skill from forming. The party does not require your participation in the ritual. You decided it did, and then attributed that decision to the party. 38. Alcohol is the fastest and most reliable relaxation tool available, and it works immediately, it works consistently, and after a genuinely difficult day, it delivers a reduction in tension that nothing else matches for speed. The first part is pharmacologically accurate. The second part, the part about what happens after, is where the mechanism quietly reverses and leaves you worse than you started, while your memory of the process credits the drink and not the rebound. The initial relaxation is real. GABA enhancement and glutamate suppression produce genuine, measurable reductions in neural excitability and anxiety in the short term. The brain then compensates through the same neuroadaptation process described in the anxiety myth. GABA receptors downregulate, glutamate activity upregulates, and the net result is an elevated baseline stress response in the hours after drinking that peaks approximately 4 to 8 hours after the last drink. This is the mechanism behind middle-of-the-night waking, the next morning anxiety that feels chemical rather than circumstantial, and the general sense of unease that follows a drinking session. The stress hormones do not politely wait until a convenient time. Cortisol and norepinephrine elevate during alcohol metabolism, peaking in the window when most people are either asleep or trying to be. Comparing alcohol as relaxation to evidence-based interventions shows a consistent pattern. Exercise produces endorphin release, reduces cortisol, and improves sleep quality. All durable outcomes with no rebound phase. Progressive muscle relaxation and mindfulness-based approaches show sustained anxiety reduction without the neuroadaptation cost. Alcohol produces the shortest lasting relief with the most pronounced negative rebound of any commonly used stress management strategy. You are renting calm by the hour with a deposit you will not recover. The landlord keeps the money. The apartment is louder when you leave than it was when you arrived. 39. Alcohol makes food taste better. Wine with dinner enhances the flavors, a cold drink elevates a meal, and the long tradition of beverage pairing with food reflects a genuine sensory truth about how alcohol interacts with what you eat. The pairing effect has real chemical components, and dismissing it entirely would be inaccurate. But the popular version of the claim that alcohol is a broad sensory enhancer that improves the eating experience glosses over what actually changes in your taste perception as blood alcohol concentration rises, and the direction of that change is not consistently upward. At low concentrations, ethanol does interact with taste receptor signaling in ways that can enhance the perception of sweetness and fat to reward relevant dimensions, and this effect is measurable. Moderate alcohol intake also mildly stimulates appetite through ghrelin effects and reduced inhibitory control over eating behavior, increasing food consumption alongside the drink. However, taste discrimination, the capacity to detect subtle flavor differences, decreases with increasing blood alcohol concentration. The nuanced pairing effects that wine professionals describe in tasting notes are precisely the kind of fine sensory distinctions that become harder to perceive as drinking progresses. The chemical interactions between wine compounds and food molecules that create new aroma combinations are a real phenomenon. But this is organic chemistry occurring in the glass and on the palate. It is not a benefit of intoxication. Many food and drink pairing effects described by experts disappear in blind conditions when the pairing label is removed, suggesting that expectation is performing significant sensory work in the reported enhancement. Alcohol's mild anesthetic effect on oral tissues reduces sensitivity to both texture and pain, altering the sensory experience of food rather than sharpening it. Alcohol does not improve the pencil, it blurs the paper. At a certain blood alcohol concentration, everything starts to look like a masterpiece, and that is the problem with using that as your quality metric. 40. The designated driver just needs to drink less than everyone else. Comparatively sober is the operating standard, not actually zero. And 2 drinks over 4 hours for someone who is clearly less impaired than their passengers is a reasonable interpretation of the role. This interpretation is not supported by crash data, impairment research, or the definition of the role as established by every road safety organization that has ever addressed it. Measurable driving impairment begins at blood alcohol concentrations between 0.02 and 0.04%, well below the legal limit in most jurisdictions and well within what most people consider a negligible amount of social drinking. At 0.05%, 2 to 3 standard drinks for an average adult, The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration data confirms a 38% increased crash risk. Reaction time degradation at this level increases stopping distance at highway speeds by several meters, a margin that is frequently the difference between collision and avoidance. The cultural norm of a designated driver who just drinks less has roots partly in alcohol industry lobbying that historically preferred responsible drinking messaging to abstinence for drivers messaging. The industry had a documented preference for framing that maintained consumption rather than eliminating it for the driving population. Social dynamics create significant pressure on designated drivers to participate minimally. The just one drink conversation is a recognized safety hazard with its own research literature. True designated driver programs, including the frameworks developed by organizations like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, define the role explicitly as zero alcohol, not reduced alcohol, not comparatively sober, not fewer drinks than the passengers. The safest driver in the car is not a useful safety measurement when the car is approaching a hazard. You needed zero. You have 2 drinks worth of less than zero. Those are not the same number. 41. Alcohol makes you do things you would not normally do. It overrides the real you, installs a temporary replacement personality, and the behaviors that emerge while drinking are the alcohol's fault rather than an expression of anything genuinely present in the person. This framing is culturally convenient, widely deployed as a post-event explanation, and largely unsupported by the behavioral science of how alcohol actually interacts with existing personality. Alcohol myopia theory, developed by psychologists Steele and Josephs, describes the mechanism with considerable precision. Alcohol narrows cognitive attention to the most immediately salient cues while reducing the weight of distant consequences in decision-making. It amplifies what is already present and reduces the inhibitory systems that normally moderate its expression. It does not write new content. Research on alcohol and aggression shows that the relationship is strongly moderated by pre-existing trait aggression. People who are more aggressive when sober show greater aggression when intoxicated, while people low in trait aggression show minimal change at equivalent blood alcohol levels. The alcohol did not create the aggression, it removed the restraint that was managing it. Studies on sexual behavior and alcohol confirm the same pattern. Alcohol reduces the inhibitory control that normally moderates existing preferences and tendencies without generating preferences that were absent before. The legal treatment of alcohol as a mitigating factor has been progressively narrowed across jurisdictions, with courts recognizing that voluntary intoxication does not eliminate the capacity for intent that was already present when the decision to drink was made. The alcohol made me do it narrative is psychologically useful because it allows the sober self to disclaim continuity with the intoxicated self's behavior. The behaviors are continuous. The inhibitory systems moderating them are not. Alcohol did not write anything new on the board. It turned off the lights on the people trying to erase what was already there. 42. Light beer is the irresponsible choice. Fewer calories, less alcohol, a genuine concession to health awareness that lets you participate in the social ritual while making the better decision. The caloric reduction is real. The assumption that this reduction translates into meaningfully lower total consumption of either calories or alcohol is where the logic breaks down, because the health halo around a lighter option reliably triggers the permission effect that erases the advantage it was supposed to provide. A standard light beer averages approximately 100 kilocalories versus approximately 150 for a regular beer, a genuine 30% reduction per drink. This sounds meaningful until you account for what researchers studying dietary compensation call the licensing effect. Choosing the healthier option generates a sense of permission to consume more of it, and studies on food and beverage choices consistently show that people who select lower calorie options consume higher total quantities, erasing or reversing the initial caloric advantage. Light beers typically run between 3.2 and 4.2% alcohol by volume versus 4.5 to 6% for standard beers. Reduced but not negligible, and sufficient to produce meaningful blood alcohol concentration at typical social consumption volumes. The reduced alcohol content per drink can create a false sense of managed intake. People feel they are controlling their consumption while their total drink count and therefore total alcohol often increases relative to what they would have consumed from stronger beer. Nutritionally, light beer offers no meaningful advantage beyond the modest caloric reduction. Vitamins, minerals, and other macronutrient differences are negligible between categories. You switch to the smaller hammer and then hit the nail 3 additional times. The outcome is identical to what the larger hammer would have produced. You feel responsible about the process, and that feeling of responsibility is the more operationally dangerous part of the equation. 43. A hot toddy when you are sick is a legitimate cold remedy. Honey, lemon, hot water, and whiskey. And the whiskey is part of the treatment, not just the part that makes the treatment enjoyable. People have been prescribing this to themselves and each other for generations. The recovery usually follows, and the association between the drink and the improvement is strong enough to have survived into an era where the mechanism can actually be examined. The honey is doing real work. It soothes mucous membranes and has documented antimicrobial properties at sufficient concentrations. The lemon contributes vitamin C and mild acidity that may help with throat comfort. The steam from the hot liquid helps with congestion. The warmth is genuinely soothing to an already stressed system. None of the therapeutic components require the whiskey. Common cold and influenza viruses replicate inside human cells. They are not accessible to circulating alcohol at any blood alcohol concentration achievable through drinking, and even if they were, the concentration required to kill pathogens is far above what any drinking volume produces in tissue. Alcohol at drinking concentrations actively suppresses immune function. Natural killer cell activity, cytokine production, and phagocytic function are all reduced in the hours following consumption, according to research published in Clinical and Experimental Immunology. When you are already sick and likely dehydrated, adding a diuretic to your system worsens the fluid balance that your immune response depends on. The medicinal alcohol tradition has historical roots in an era when effective alternatives were absent and doctors prescribed wine and spirits for reasons that have not held up to clinical review. The scaffold was doing good work. The wrecking ball attached to it was not contributing. Give credit to the scaffold. Seriously reconsider the ball. 44. The health risks of alcohol are a concern for people with drinking problems, not for social drinkers operating within normal cultural parameters. The warnings apply to a specific subset of the population, and if your consumption looks nothing like what gets described in clinical literature on alcohol use disorder, the risk profile being discussed is not really about you. The dose-dependent cancer risk, the injury risk, and the cardiovascular effects documented in research apply across the entire consumption distribution, including at levels that most people would describe as normal social drinking, and the population-level burden of alcohol-related harm falls substantially on moderate and light drinkers simply because this group is far larger than the heavy drinking population. Breast cancer risk increases measurably starting from approximately 1 drink per day, an effect documented in multiple large meta-analyses with no identified consumption threshold below which risk returns to baseline for this specific cancer. The cancer-causing mechanism of alcohol involves acetaldehyde DNA damage and folate metabolism disruption, and these processes operate at all doses. The threshold below which genetic damage does not occur has not been established in the literature. Road fatality and injury data show alcohol involvement across all drinking categories. The majority of alcohol-involved accidents do not involve clinically diagnosable heavy drinkers. Domestic violence statistics consistently show alcohol as a primary contributing factor, and the majority of those incidents do not involve people meeting clinical criteria for alcohol use disorder. Drowning, fall injury, and accidental death data all show alcohol involvement beginning at low blood alcohol concentration levels. The global burden of disease research found that a meaningful proportion of alcohol's total global health impact falls on the low to moderate drinking population because the sheer size of that group produces large absolute numbers even at lower individual risk. Seatbelts exist because crashes happen to all drivers. The warning is for the distribution. You are in the distribution. 45. Years of drinking have built a tolerance that means alcohol affects you less, your body has adapted, and the adaptation represents a form of physiological management that makes your drinking safer than it would be for someone less experienced. High tolerance gets described as a sign of control of a body that has learned to handle something efficiently. Pharmacologically, tolerance is a sign that the brain has adapted to the presence of a substance it is treating as a persistent chemical environment, which is a description of dependency progression, not a safety achievement. Tolerance develops through neuroadaptation, receptors downregulate, and compensatory mechanisms engage, reducing subjective intoxication without reducing any of the physical damage occurring in parallel. The liver damage produced by chronic alcohol exposure is not subject to tolerance. Cirrhosis risk scales with cumulative alcohol consumption regardless of how impaired the person feels while drinking. Cancer risk scales with total exposure to acetaldehyde and alcohol's other carcinogenic mechanisms, not with subjective intoxication level. Tolerance provides no buffer against carcinogenicity. High tolerance is in fact a clinical risk marker. It appears as a diagnostic criterion for alcohol use disorder in the DSM, not as evidence of healthy adaptation. The physical withdrawal risk increases with the degree of tolerance. The higher the tolerance, the more severe the potential withdrawal syndrome when drinking stops. Because the compensatory neuroadaptation that reduces subjective effects while drinking becomes a source of hyperexcitability when the alcohol is removed. High tolerance drinkers are statistically among the most resistant to recognizing their actual risk level because their subjective experience of alcohol has decoupled from the objective consumption and damage occurring underneath it. You trained yourself not to hear the fire alarm. The fire is still happening at the same rate it always was. You have simply become a less reliable evacuation system. 46 non-alcoholic beer is exactly what the label says. Alcohol-free, a safe choice for designated drivers, people in recovery, pregnant women, and anyone who wants to participate in the ritual without any alcohol exposure. The label is a regulatory category, not a guarantee of zero alcohol content, and for specific populations, the difference between the regulatory definition and literal zero is clinically meaningful. Most beverages marketed as non-alcoholic contain up to 0.5% alcohol by volume, the threshold below which most jurisdictions permit the non-alcoholic label under their food and beverage regulations. Testing of branded non-alcoholic products by consumer groups and academic researchers has found actual alcohol contents across a range, with some products testing above their labeled maximum. For people in recovery from alcohol use disorder, even trace alcohol can trigger cravings and neurological responses. Clinical guidance typically recommends avoiding any product with detectable alcohol content, not products below a regulatory threshold. Pregnant women advised to abstain entirely are not risk-free when choosing beverages containing up to 0.5% alcohol by volume. The recommended threshold for fetal safety is 0, which is a different number. Total consumption across a long social session is also relevant. Consuming 10 non-alcoholic beers to match the alcohol of a single standard 5% beer is possible across the course of an evening, making accumulated intake meaningful. True alcohol-free products marketed at 0.0%. ABV do exist and are increasingly available in most markets. The distinction between these and 0.5% products is not meaningful for most consumers and is clinically significant for specific populations. The label is telling you about a regulatory category. It is not telling you that the container is empty of the thing you are trying to avoid. Mostly empty and completely empty are different conditions, and for certain users, that difference is the entire point. 47. Humans have always drunk alcohol, and every culture throughout history has had its fermented beverage and its drinking tradition. Sobriety is the modern anomaly. Drinking is the default human condition, and framing alcohol as a cultural universal gives it a kind of civilizational inevitability that makes questioning it seem naive. Significant cultures and civilizations throughout history have been explicitly alcohol-free or predominantly abstaining, and a substantial portion of the present world's population does not drink for religious, cultural, or personal reasons. Islam's prohibition of alcohol is followed by approximately 1.8 billion people globally, one of the largest sustained alcohol-free cultural traditions in recorded history. Buddhism, Mormonism, certain Hindu traditions, and various Protestant denominations include alcohol prohibition or strong temperance traditions that have produced large abstaining populations across multiple centuries and continents. Globally, approximately 43 to 45% of the world's population reports not drinking alcohol at all, making non-drinkers a near majority of humanity rather than a fringe exception. Pre-Columbian societies in several regions had limited or ceremonially restricted alcohol access. It was not a universal daily practice across human cultures at any historical point. The temperance and prohibition movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries drew significant political majorities in multiple countries, representing large-scale, broadly supported social movements against alcohol consumption that are incompatible with the narrative of drinking as universal human behavior. The framing of alcohol as an inevitable feature of human civilization serves primarily to normalize what is, at the global scale, a culturally specific practice with enormous variation in adoption. You describe something as universal and then discovered it does not apply to nearly half the people on the planet. At that point, the word universal is doing work that the actual numbers will not support. 48. Somewhere in the accumulated folk wisdom and morning after desperation, there's a hangover cure. Raw eggs, grease, sports drinks, activated charcoal, vitamin supplements, pickle juice, specific food combinations consumed at specific times. The trial and error of millions of people across decades has surely produced something that works. A systematic review of hangover remedy studies published in the British Medical Journal examined the available evidence and found no convincing scientific support for any supplement, food, or behavioral intervention reliably preventing or treating hangover symptoms. The multifactorial nature of hangovers is the core problem. Acetaldehyde toxicity, inflammatory, cytokine release, sleep architecture disruption, dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, and hypoglycemia do not share a common treatment pathway, meaning any single intervention addresses at best one component while the others continue operating. Greasy food before drinking may slow gastric emptying and reduce peak blood alcohol concentration and absorption effect. But greasy food consumed after drinking has no physiological mechanism that addresses the metabolic processes already underway. Electrolyte drinks address the dehydration and electrolyte component competently, but leave the inflammatory and toxic components entirely untouched. Pain relievers carry specific risks in the hangover context. Acetaminophen and alcohol compete for the same hepatic processing pathways, creating toxicity risk at doses that would otherwise be safe, while NSAIDs increase gastric irritation that is already present in most hangover states. The recovery breakfast likely helps with the hypoglycemia component. Blood sugar stabilization produces real symptom relief and provides sensory comfort that improves mood, which explains why it feels like it is working without constituting a treatment for the remaining active processes. Time and water are the only interventions with consistent, unambiguous effect across all hangover components because they address the underlying metabolic timeline. You have 17 theories about fixing an engine after driving it into a wall. Some address real things. None of them undrive the car. 49. All alcohol is processed by the body the same way. Ethanol is ethanol. The liver runs the same enzymatic pathway regardless of the source, and the specific beverage you chose is irrelevant to what happens metabolically after you drink it. The ethanol metabolism pathway is consistent across beverage types. The other compounds arriving alongside the ethanol are not consistent, and some of them have meaningfully different toxicity profiles that the liver must address separately. Methanol is present in small amounts in many fermented beverages, particularly in inadequately distilled homemade spirits and some fruit wines, and it is metabolized by the same enzymes as ethanol, but produces formaldehyde and formic acid as metabolic intermediates. compound substantially more toxic than acetaldehyde. Commercial distillation specifically removes the early distillate fraction, called the heads, which is methanol concentrated. Inadequate or absent distillations leaves dangerous methanol levels, which is why homemade spirits carry a categorically different risk profile than commercial products. Congeners in aged and dark spirits create additional metabolic load on the liver, extending total processing time compared to filtered spirits with minimal congener content. Sulfites in wine trigger distinct reactions in sensitive individuals through mechanisms separate from alcohol metabolism. Immune responses that produce symptoms often attributed to the alcohol itself. Histamines produced during fermentation and concentrated through skin contact in red wine processing produce allergic-type responses independent of blood alcohol concentration. The toxic methanol contamination events that have killed dozens to hundreds of people during unregulated spirits production in multiple countries over recent decades represent a documented recurring demonstration that not all alcohol is equivalent once you look past the ethanol content. The engine runs on all of them. Some fuels leave more residue, some carry contaminants, and some are effectively paint thinner with a label. The intake valve does not discriminate, the outcome does. 50. What you drink is your business. Adults have the right to make their own choices about alcohol consumption, and those choices primarily affect the person making them. This is the personal liberty framing of alcohol, and it describes a transaction between an individual and a substance while systematically excluding the people who are affected by that transaction without choosing to participate in it. Alcohol produces more documented harm to people other than the drinker than almost any other commonly used substance, and the personal choice framing depends on not counting those people. The World Health Organization estimates that alcohol contributes to more than 3 million deaths globally per year, a figure that includes tens of thousands of people killed annually in road accidents by drivers other than themselves, domestic violence victims, and children affected by prenatal alcohol exposure. In the United States in 2022, 13,524 people died in alcohol-impaired driving crashes, the majority of whom were not the impaired driver. Domestic violence research consistently identifies alcohol as a primary contributing factor, and the victim in a domestic violence incident did not elect to participate in the drinker's consumption decision. The economic externalities of alcohol, healthcare expenditure, lost workplace productivity, criminal justice system costs, property damage, have been estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually in the United States alone, distributed across the entire population through insurance premiums, tax expenditure, and public resource allocation. Children of parents with alcohol use disorder face elevated risk of abuse, neglect, developmental disruption, and their own eventual substance use disorders. A multi-generational harm pattern originating in one person's consumption. The Nutt et al. Lancet study ranked alcohol highest of all assessed substances on the harm to others dimension, specifically because legal status and social normalization create exposure at a scale illegal substances cannot approach. The personal choice framing only holds when the consequences stay personal. They do not. 51. You already know the dangerous myths about alcohol. You are an informed adult who has been around drinking your whole life. You have heard the warnings, processed the information, and developed a reasonably accurate model of what alcohol does and does not do. This video was probably aimed at other people. The myths you have just heard exposed across the last 50 items are not beginner myths. They are not the errors of inexperienced drinkers encountering alcohol for the first time. Beer before liquor, coffee sobers you up, I know my limits, it warms you up, sleeping it off. These are the myths held most confidently by people with the most experience, because experience without correction is just repeated exposure to the same wrong model. Social drinking culture specifically reinforces these beliefs because they are self-serving. They allow continued drinking within a framework that feels responsible, calibrated, and informed. Research on belief updating consistently finds that people are most resistant to correcting beliefs they actively use to justify ongoing behavior. The functional benefit of the myth is what makes the myth sticky. The most cited reason people do not seek assessment or support for problematic drinking is the belief that their consumption is not severe enough to warrant it. A belief that is itself downstream of the normalizing mythology this video has been tearing down for the last several thousand words. Every single myth covered here exists because it performs a psychological function. It makes drinking feel safer, more controllable, and more socially rational than the evidence supports. That is what myths do. They are the stories a system tells itself to keep operating without confronting what the data actually shows. The blind spot is located precisely where you are most certain you are paying attention. You have been looking in the right direction. You have been looking at a mirror. Now you know what the other side looks like. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.